October 23rd, 1942, El Alamein, Egypt. The British 8th Army stood at the edge of the desert, staring at what looked like an impossible wall. Across 40 miles of sand and rock, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had built the most deadly barrier anyone had ever seen. 500,000 landmines buried in the ground, machine gun nests every few hundred yards, barbed wire stretching as far as the eye could see. Behind it all, the undefeated Afrika Korps waited with their tanks and guns. This is the story of how Australia's 9th Division changed everything about fighting Germany in World War II. The British had tried to break through before. Every single time, they failed. In the last year and a half, 80,000 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured trying to push Rommel back. 80,000 men. That's more people than live in many cities. Each attack followed the same plan. First, artillery guns would fire shells at the German lines for hours. The noise was so loud it made men's ears ring for days. Then, thousands of soldiers would climb out of their trenches and walk forward in straight lines across open ground. The Germans would wait until the British got close. Then they would open fire. Men fell like wheat cut down by a scythe. The few who made it through the minefields were too tired and too few to hold their ground. Within days, sometimes hours, they had to fall back. All those deaths for nothing. Back in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill needed a victory. He needed it desperately. Britain had been fighting Germany for 3 years and losing almost everywhere. If Rommel broke through at El Alamein, he would capture the Suez Canal. That would cut off Britain's supply line to India and the oil fields of the Middle East. Without oil, British ships couldn't sail. British planes couldn't fly. British tanks couldn't move. Churchill told his new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, to win or else. The problem was that Montgomery only knew one way to fight, the same way that had already failed so many times. Montgomery planned another frontal assault. His staff officers spread maps across tables in the command tent. They moved little flags around, showing where divisions would attack. They calculated how many shells to fire, how many men to send forward, how long it would take. On paper, it looked perfect. But when they ran practice attacks in the empty desert, nothing worked right. The timing was always wrong. The soldiers couldn't move fast enough through the sand. The artillery couldn't hit the right targets. After 18 months of trying to break Rommel's line, the British still had no answer. Their best generals studied the maps and shook their heads. Some quietly wondered if El Alamein could be won at all. Then Montgomery met Major General Leslie Morshead. Morshead commanded Australia's 9th Division, 20,000 men who had sailed across the Indian Ocean to fight in North Africa. The British. Officers didn't think much of the Australians. They called them undisciplined colonials. The Australians didn't salute properly. They argued with their officers. They wore their uniforms however they wanted. Some British generals thought they looked more like pirates than soldiers. At formal meetings, Morshead's men would lean against walls and smoke cigarettes while British officers stood at attention. The British Army had rules about everything, and the Australians seemed to break every single one. But the Australians had something the British didn't have. They had survived the siege of Tobruk. For 8 months in 1941, Rommel had surrounded the port city of Tobruk and tried to capture it. 20,000 Australians held him off. They couldn't fight the way the British Army taught. They didn't have enough men for big frontal attacks. They didn't have enough ammunition to waste. So they learned a different way. They learned to fight at night when the Germans couldn't see them coming. They learned to move in small groups, quiet as shadows. They learned to hit hard and disappear before the enemy could hit back. They learned to stay alive when every rule said they should die. Montgomery's planning staff didn't care about Tobruk. They had their textbooks and their battle plans. They insisted on the traditional approach: artillery bombardment, then massed infantry assault, then tanks pushing through. That's how the British Army had fought for 100 years. That's how they would fight at El Alamein. When Morshead tried to explain what his division had learned, British staff officers cut him off. One told him directly that Australian tactics were too irregular. Another said they lacked the decisive punch needed for a real battle. The British Army didn't need advice from colonials who couldn't even march in straight lines. Montgomery himself wasn't sure what to think. His staff officers had been clear in their opinions. Australian tactics were irregular, undisciplined, and lacked the decisive punch needed for a real battle. But Montgomery had also seen conventional British tactics fail again and again in the desert. The textbook methods weren't working. Maybe it was time to consider something different, no matter how irregular it seemed. That night, Morshead sat with Montgomery and explained his idea. Forget the big breakthrough. Forget sending thousands of men charging across open ground. Instead, attack at night with small units. Move forward 200 yards, destroy one German position, then stop and dig in. Wait until the next night, then do it again. Keep doing it, night after night, grinding down the German defences piece by piece. Morshead called it crumbling. Like crumbling a wall bit by bit instead of trying to smash through it all at once. It would take longer. It wouldn't look glorious, but the men would live and the Germans would die. Montgomery listened in silence. Everything Morshead said went against every lesson taught at British military academies, but Montgomery had seen those lessons fail over and over in the desert sand. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let the undisciplined colonials show everyone a better way to kill Germans. The technical details of Morshead's plan were simple but precise. Each attack would start at exactly 10 o'clock at night. Not 9:59, not 10:01, 10 o'clock sharp. The artillery would fire for 3 hours, moving forward in a careful pattern. Every 8 minutes, the shells would land 200 yards farther ahead. That 8-minute timing was critical. It gave the infantry just enough time to move up behind the explosions without getting hit by their own guns. The attacking force would be small, just 20 to 30 men per group. They would move in the darkness under the cover of the artillery fire, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. When they reached a German position, they wouldn't try to capture it and hold it forever. They would destroy it completely, kill or capture everyone there, then dig in and wait for daylight. The next night, they would do it again. 200 yards at a time. Slow, steady, deadly. In September 1942, 6 weeks before the battle, the Australians practiced their attacks in empty desert far behind the lines. Montgomery sent observers to watch. The British officers brought notebooks and measured everything. They counted casualties in the practice runs. When the Australians attacked at night using their methods, 60% fewer men got hit compared to daylight attacks. 60%. That meant for every 10 men who would die in a regular British assault, only 4 would die doing it the Australian way. The numbers were impossible to ignore, but Montgomery's chief of staff ignored them anyway. He called the plan too slow. He said it lacked decisive punch. A real battle needed speed and power, not this careful creeping forward. Other British generals agreed. They demanded a traditional massed assault. Thousands of men going over the top at once, backed by hundreds of tanks. That's what won battles. That's what the history books would remember. Montgomery had a choice to make. He could listen to his staff and do things the British way. Or he could trust 20,000 Australians who fought like no one had ever taught them to fight. On October 15th, 8 days before the battle, Montgomery drove out to watch the Australians practice one more time. The sun had set an hour earlier. The desert was pitch black except for stars overhead. Montgomery stood on a small hill with his binoculars, watching the empty sand below. At exactly 10 o'clock, the practice artillery started firing. He could see the flashes in the distance, hear the thunder rolling across the desert. Then he saw something that made him lean forward and stare harder. Small groups of men were moving through the darkness like ghosts. He could barely see them, even though he knew exactly where to look. They moved in short bursts, dropping flat every few yards, completely silent. When they reached their practice targets, they attacked from 3 directions at once. The whole thing was over in minutes. Montgomery checked his watch again. He did the math in his head. The Australians had just moved 300 yards, destroyed 4 practice positions, and gotten back to their starting point. A British battalion doing the same thing in daylight would still be trying to get through the first minefield. That night, Montgomery made his decision. He gave the 9th Division the most important job in the entire battle. They would attack in the northern corridor, right where Rommel expected the main British push. They would be the tip of the spear. Every other division would adjust their plans to match what the Australians did. It was an enormous gamble. Montgomery was betting the whole battle on methods that his own staff said wouldn't work. He was trusting colonials that his officers called undisciplined. If it failed, Churchill would fire him. Britain might lose North Africa. The war might be lost. But Montgomery had run out of other ideas. The Australians got ready using whatever they could find. They didn't have fancy equipment. They had captured German rifles because they were better than British ones. They had modified British mortars to fire faster. They strapped extra water bottles to their belts because fighting at night in the desert made men thirsty. For communications, they couldn't use radios because radio signals would tell the Germans where they were. Instead, they used runners, young soldiers who would sprint back and forth through the darkness carrying messages. They used coloured flares to signal when they captured a position. Green meant success. Red meant they needed help. White meant pull back. It was simple, but it worked. October 23rd arrived. At precisely 10 o'clock that night, the entire British artillery force opened fire. 900 guns firing at once. The noise was so loud it could be heard in Cairo, 70 miles away. The ground shook like an earthquake. Flames from the gun barrels lit up the night sky. Behind that wall of explosions, the Australian 9th Division climbed out of their trenches and started walking toward the German lines. They moved in small groups, 20 men here, 30 men there, spread across 2 miles of front. German machine guns opened up, their traces cutting through the darkness like deadly fireflies. Shells exploded around the Australians, throwing up geysers of sand and rock. Men fell. But the rest kept moving forward, staying behind the curtain of their own artillery fire. By dawn on October 24th, the Australians had punched 4 miles into the German defences. 4 miles in one night. That was farther than any British attack had gotten in the last year and a half of fighting. They had captured 600 German soldiers who were too shocked and confused to fight back. The Germans had expected a massive daylight attack they could see coming. Instead, the Australians had appeared out of the darkness like demons, hitting positions from behind and from the sides, places the Germans thought were safe. The cost was 300 Australian casualties. Montgomery's staff had predicted 1,500 casualties for a conventional assault to gain that much ground. The Australians had just proven that Moorehead's way worked. Not on a practice range, not in theory, in real combat, against the best soldiers Germany had. The German commanders were completely confused. Their defensive plans assumed they could see the British coming. They assumed they would have time to move their tanks and guns to meet the attack. But the Australians attacked when it was too dark to see, moved too fast to track, and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. By the time the sun came up and the Germans could see what had happened, the Australians had already dug in so deep that it would cost thousands of lives to push them back out. Rommel's officers looked at their maps and couldn't believe what they were seeing. 4 miles lost in one night. That wasn't supposed to be possible. And the worst part was, they knew the Australians would do it again the next night, and the night after that, grinding forward bit by bit until there was nothing left to defend. The numbers told a story that nobody could argue with. Before the Australians showed their way of fighting, traditional British attacks at El Alamein had a terrible record. For every German soldier killed or wounded, 4 British soldiers fell, 4-1. That meant the Germans were winning even when they lost ground, because Britain was running out of men faster than Germany was. The Australian crumbling operations flipped those numbers completely around. Now, for every German casualty, only 2 Australians fell. And sometimes the ratio was even better than that. In the first week of fighting, the 9th Division captured 3,000 German soldiers. 3,000. In all the British offensives before October, they had captured only 400 Germans total. The Australians had caught more enemy soldiers in 7 nights than the entire British 8th Army had caught in 18 months. Montgomery watched those numbers come in and made a decision that shocked his staff officers. On October 28th, 5 days into the battle, he ordered every Commonwealth division to start fighting the Australian way. The British divisions, the New Zealand divisions, the South African divisions, the Indian divisions. Everyone would now attack at night in small groups, moving forward carefully, crumbling the German line piece by piece. His staff officers protested. They said it would take too long to retrain everyone. They said soldiers needed weeks of practice to learn night fighting. Montgomery didn't care. He had seen the casualty reports. He had seen how far the Australians had advanced while other divisions were stuck. He gave the order, and that was final. Within 3 days, 195,000 Commonwealth troops were trying to copy what 20,000 Australians had been doing since Tobruk. The results were stunning. Over the 12 days of the Battle of El Alamein, the Allied forces captured 30,000 Axis soldiers using the adapted Australian tactics. 30,000. Entire German battalions surrendered when Australians appeared out of the darkness behind them, cutting off their escape routes. Italian divisions that had held their ground for months collapsed in a single night when small groups of Commonwealth soldiers infiltrated their positions and attacked from within. The total British casualties were 40% lower than what Montgomery's staff had originally predicted for a conventional assault. 40%. That meant thousands of mothers got their sons back alive instead of getting a telegram saying their boy had died in the desert. But Rommel wasn't going to give up without a fight. He knew the Australians were the key to Montgomery's success. If he could break the 9th Division, the whole British attack would fall apart. On November 1st, Rommel gathered his best remaining forces for a massive counterattack. The 15th Panzer Division, his elite tank unit, rolled north with 100 tanks, 100 steel monsters, each one armed with an 88mm gun that could punch through any British armour. Behind them came 2,000 German infantry, the survivors of a dozen desert battles. Rommel's plan was simple: smash into the Australian positions with overwhelming force, break through their lines, get behind them and cut them off, force them to retreat or surrender. Then the whole British offensive would stall. The German attack came at dawn on November 2nd. The Australians heard the tanks before they saw them. The ground rumbled. The air filled with the roar of diesel engines and the squealing of tank treads on sand. Then the panzers appeared over the ridge line, black shapes against the rising sun. The Australians were dug in deep, their positions reinforced during the night. They had anti-tank guns hidden behind sand walls. They had mines laid in patterns the Germans couldn't see. They had learned at Tobruk how to fight tanks when you don't have tanks of your own. You let them come close. You stay hidden. You wait until they're right on top of you. Then you kill them. The German tanks charged forward, confident they would crush the Australian line in minutes. Instead, they ran straight into a killing zone. Anti-tank guns opened fire from 3 sides. Tanks exploded, their ammunition cooking off in huge fireballs. Surviving panzers tried to back away, but hit mines that blew their treads off. German infantry, following behind the tanks, got caught in machine gun fire and artillery. The attack fell apart in less than an hour. Rommel lost 37 tanks and 500 men. The Australian line didn't budge an inch. A British officer, watching from a nearby hill, wrote in his diary that night, "They taught us how to fight at night and not die doing it." The Germans tried 2 more times over the next 3 days to break the Australians. Each time they failed. Each time they lost men and tanks they couldn't replace. Rommel himself wrote about it later in his personal diary. His words were simple, but they told the whole story. The Australians fought with particular tenacity. Our attacks simply shattered against their defense. This was the man who had never lost a battle in Africa. The man British generals feared more than anyone else. And he was saying his attacks shattered against Australian farm boys and factory workers who had learned to fight in the desperate streets of Tobruk. The contrast with British units using traditional methods was impossible to ignore. The British XXX Corps attacked in the southern part of the line using conventional daylight assaults. In 11 days of fighting, they advanced 3.5 miles and lost 4,000 men. The Australian 9th Division, fighting in the north with their night crumbling tactics, advanced 6 miles in 8 days and lost half as many soldiers. Same enemy, same desert, different methods, completely different results. The night fighting created scenes that men would remember for the rest of their lives. The desert at midnight was cold, the temperature dropping to 45 degrees after baking at over 100 degrees during the day. Soldiers shivered in their thin uniforms as they crept forward through the darkness. The only sounds were boots crunching on sand, the distant rumble of artillery, and sometimes the sudden crack of a rifle when someone spotted movement. The smell of cordite from exploded shells mixed with the clean scent of desert air. When flares went up, the whole battlefield would freeze like a photograph. Men caught in the light would drop flat and hold absolutely still, hoping the Germans couldn't tell them apart from rocks and shadows. Sometimes Australian soldiers and German soldiers would find themselves 20 yards apart when a flare lit up the night. Both sides frozen, staring at each other, waiting for the light to die so they could move again. The Australians would crawl through minefields with their bayonets, probing the sand every 6 inches, feeling for the buried explosives. One wrong move and the mine would go off, killing the man and alerting every German within 500 yards. It took nerves of steel to do that work, hour after hour, night after night, knowing that any second could be your last. But they did it because the alternative was marching across open ground in daylight where German machine guns would cut them down like grass. The unexpected consequences of the Australian tactics went far beyond Alamein. The Germans had to completely rewrite their defensive doctrine. Their whole strategy had been built around stopping attacks they could see coming in daylight. Now, they had to defend against enemies who attacked in darkness from unexpected directions. Rommel's officers worked through the night trying to create new defensive plans, but they were always one step behind. By the time they figured out how to counter the Australian methods, the battle was already lost. Even more surprising, American forces training for the invasion of North Africa in November 1942 heard about the Australian tactics and immediately started copying them. US Army officers visited Australian units to learn their methods. Within months, American soldiers were using modified versions of Australian night fighting techniques in Tunisia and Morocco. By the end of the 12-day battle, the numbers were overwhelming. 195,000 Commonwealth troops had learned at least the basics of the Australian way of fighting. British casualties were thousands lower than predicted. The German Afrika Korps was broken and running west across Libya, and all of it started with 20,000 undisciplined colonials who refused to die the way the textbooks said they should. The story of what happened after El Alamein is almost as important as the battle itself. The Australian methods didn't disappear when the fighting stopped. Instead, they spread across the entire Allied war effort like ripples in a pond. Within months of the victory at El Alamein, military commanders from every Allied nation wanted to know how the Australians had done it. British officers who had called them undisciplined colonials were now begging for Australian instructors to teach their men. American generals preparing for the invasion of Europe sent observers to study Australian training methods. The Soviet Union even requested detailed reports about the night fighting tactics, though they were halfway around the world fighting on the Eastern Front. In 1943 and 1944, veterans of the Australian 9th Division found themselves pulled away from combat to become teachers. They trained US Army Rangers in night infiltration techniques. They taught British commandos how to move silently through enemy territory. They showed Canadian infantry how to attack in small groups without losing coordination. These weren't classrooms with blackboards and textbooks. The Australians taught the way they had learned, through hard practice in the desert and jungle. They would take soldiers out at midnight and make them crawl through obstacle courses in pitch darkness. They would set up practice defenses and tell units to attack them without making a sound. Any soldier who made too much noise had to do it again, and again, and again, until they got it right. The techniques proved just as deadly in the Pacific as they had been in North Africa. When the Australians fought Japanese forces in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, they used the same crumbling tactics they had perfected at El Alamein. The jungle was different from the desert, but the principles were the same. Move at night, attack in small groups, hit hard and disappear. Keep grinding forward until the enemy breaks. The Japanese had never faced anything like it. Their defensive tactics assumed they could see the enemy coming through the jungle. Instead, Australian soldiers would appear out of nowhere in the middle of the night, deep behind Japanese lines, destroying supply dumps and command posts before vanishing back into the darkness. It drove the Japanese commanders to distraction. By the 1950s, the Australian way of fighting had become standard practice for NATO forces. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union, and military planners knew that any future war would require exactly the kind of tactics the Australians had developed. You couldn't stop modern armies with frontal assaults and massed formations anymore. You needed small unit, tactics, night operations, and independent thinking by soldiers on the ground. The Australian methods were studied, refined, and written into official military doctrine. By 1955, the Modern Infantry Night Operations Manual used by NATO forces contained 17 specific procedures that had been developed by the Australian 9th Division. 17. Everything from the 8-minute artillery timing to the way soldiers probed for mines with bayonets. The word crumbling disappeared from official use. Military textbooks called it systematic reduction instead, which sounded more professional. But it was the same thing the Australians had invented out of sheer necessity in the desert. Major General Leslie Morshead, the man who had championed the tactics and convinced Montgomery to use them, got promoted after El Alamein. He commanded Australian forces in New Guinea and fought the Japanese with the same methods that had beaten the Germans. But when the war ended and the honours were handed out, something strange happened. Montgomery got a knighthood and became Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. Other British generals who had fought at El Alamein received titles and medals and public praise. Morshead got a promotion and a handshake. The British government never offered him a knighthood, even though his tactics had saved thousands of British lives and won the battle that changed the war. He retired from the army in 1946 and went back to Australia. He ran a business, stayed out of the spotlight, and rarely talked about the war. When he died in 1959, the newspapers in London barely mentioned it. Outside of Australia, most people had already forgotten his name. This pattern repeated itself throughout military history. Innovation almost always comes from outsiders, from people who aren't bound by the way things have always been done. The Australian soldiers weren't graduates of famous military academies. They hadn't spent years studying ancient battles and classical strategy. They were farmers and factory workers and shop clerks who learned to fight by fighting, who survived by figuring out what worked instead of what the textbooks said should work. They had no choice. Follow the rules and die, or break the rules and live. When survival depends on innovation, people innovate. When they can hide behind tradition and let someone else take the risk, they usually do. The lesson here cuts deep into human nature. Formal education matters. Training matters. But necessity and real experience matter more. A soldier who has been shot at learns faster than a soldier who has only read about being shot at. The Australians at Tobruk had spent 8 months getting shot at, bombed, and shelled while surrounded by enemies. They learned things you can't learn in a classroom. They learned that small groups of determined men can do things that large formations cannot. They learned that darkness is a weapon if you know how to use it. They learned that slow and careful beats, fast and reckless every single time. And when they got the chance to apply those lessons at El Alamein, they revolutionized warfare. The impact still echoes today. Modern soldiers fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan used urban combat tactics that look remarkably similar to what the Australians did in the desert 70 years ago. Small units moving through city streets at night. Systematic clearing of buildings one room at a time. Careful coordination without rigid control from above. The US Army's field manual for urban operations could have been written by Leslie Morshead, though his name appears nowhere in it. Special operations forces around the world, from Navy SEALs to British SAS, emphasise the same principles of small unit autonomy that the Australians pioneered. Give well-trained soldiers a mission and trust them to figure out how to accomplish it. Don't micromanage from headquarters. Let the people on the ground make decisions because they can see things that headquarters cannot. Yet militaries still struggle with the tension between centralised planning and field innovation. Generals still want control. Staff officers still trust their maps and calculations more than they trust the judgment of soldiers in the mud. The same arguments that happened before El Alamein happen today in conference rooms and command centres around the world. Should we stick with proven methods or try something new? Should we trust the experts or listen to the people with actual combat experience? The Australian story gives us an answer, but it's an answer that makes people uncomfortable because it challenges authority and questions expertise and suggests that sometimes the people at the bottom know better than the people at the top. Here is the truth that El Alamein teaches us. Victory belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those willing to reimagine how resources are used. The British had more men, more tanks, more guns, and more supplies than the Australians, but they kept using them the same way, expecting different results. The Australians had less of everything except one critical resource. They had the wisdom that comes from survival. They had learned in the desperate mathematics of staying alive against impossible odds that there is always a better way if you're willing to look for it. Survival breeds innovation better than privilege ever could. The greatest military breakthroughs don't come from generals in comfortable headquarters or professors in universities. They come from soldiers who have looked death in the face and decided they would rather change the rules than die following them. That was true in 1942. That was true in 1945. That is true today. And it will be true as long as human beings fight wars and face impossible challenges and refuse to give up. The Australians proved it in the sand at El Alamein, and the lesson is written in the survival of every soldier who came after them.